Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to open the last panel of today's discussion, the fourth session, New Forms of Work, Fair Working Condition and Adequate Social Protection. And since I started yesterday with some historical facts that I found in one BBC article, I'll just try to open the discussion with them. In 1589, knitting machines will turn workers into beggars. Queen Elizabeth I was unimpressed when clergyman William Lee tried to patent the stocking frame knitting machine, and she said, "Consider though that the invention could do to my poor subjects," she said. "I would assuredly bring to them ruin by depriving them of employment." Then in 1811 and 1816s, the new mechanical loom did put hand weavers out of work. This sparkled the Luddite riots in the 80s, giving the word Luddite. But in the long term, the mechanization of manufacturing drove up wages and created more jobs than it destroyed. In 1930, economist John Myron Keynes predicted automation would usher in an age of leisure and abundance within 100 years. Everybody will need to do some work if he is to be contented, he wrote. But 3 hours a day is quite enough. So let's talk about how many hours we should work and what are the conditions that we'll have to form as governments, as social partners, as people that are entitled to provide the necessary legislation and create the sustainability of jobs. Within the concept note, we have opened two questions: how to ensure the sustainability of social security system in a labor market that is changing due to digitalization, and how to ensure a proper work-life balance in the context of permanent connection through telecommunication technologies. Do we need to establish a right to disconnect? And I would put three additional questions opening the presentations. Is the link between the reduction of working time and labor productivity in the digital economy unambiguous? How to achieve an economically and socially balanced level of flexibility and protection in non-standard forms of employment, for example, for 0 hours labor contracts, shared employment, or other atypical forms? What mechanism can be established for protection of employed persons in shared economy to ensure safety and health to work, decent pay, working time, and breaks in accordance with labor law? I would first like to give the floor of Stephen Olsen, our dear friend of Bulgaria. He is director responsible for employment in DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion in the European Commission, a Swedish lawyer with degrees in international and tax law, having joined the European Commission in 1996. He dealt with fundamental rights issues as well as social dialogue. He was assistant to the Director General of DG EMPO for 5 years before leading the unit dealing with social employment law and policy, as well as administrative affairs. And we have the honor to be responsible for Bulgaria also. So, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Minister and Minister. It's an honor for me to add a little piece of the puzzle to this bigger picture that you are wanting to build with this event and your presidency overall. In following up from the Estonian presidency, and I'm sure moving on to the next presidency in dealing with this very multifaceted question of how can we respond and deal with the future of work. I would first like to thank you very much, you ministers, but also all your colleagues, down to your soldiers of Michal and Todor, and in all the work you're doing during the presidency to deal with the work all the work that's on the table. We're at a crucial moment, of course, in terms of delivery under this legislature. and you and your staff is doing a fantastic job, and we're doing our best not to get you bored or inactive as well. No, so I'll speak particularly about the issue of non-standard forms of work, and I'd like to start with this picture, which is a projection, a possible projection of how it will look in the future. Of course, we have to see that we have to look at this from Fond's perspective of the VUCA environment, and there might be other factors that comes into this picture that will change it completely. But if we look at this particular parameter of non-standard forms of work, we can see that the projections would bring us from 30% in 95 to 50% in 250 and 70% in 280. So that is a big change in how we deal with how the labor market works and how the individual relates to the labor market. And we've heard many interesting presentations today about the aspects of that in terms of skills, in terms of needs of employers, etc. In that context. From the perspective I'll talk about now, we're looking into the precariousness that some of these non-standard forms of work can give. Or produce. Of course, many of these jobs are high-skilled individuals who are choosing this type of work for a number of personal and professional reasons. But there is also a group of workers who are placed in jobs. In very precarious jobs. It can be the famous zero-hour contracts, which could be coupled with an exclusivity clause, meaning that while they have no guaranteed hours, while they have very low pay, they're not even allowed to take up another job. It can be that you're in one of these very precarious jobs, being called in at short notice, and if you're not called in, you're never called again, which means that you have to be on a constant standby, and therefore not being able to deal with family matters, with reskilling, etc. It's true, and I think that this is one important issue that we need to deal with, is that the data exactly on how big this proportion is, the precarious proportion of this proportion you see in front of you, that data we need to develop further. And I think that's one important point that we need to make when we discuss this, that we don't have enough statistics on really the partition, so to say, of how these different colors here are classified in terms of precariousness. What we have wanted to do in light of the social pillar is to address some of the more dangerous or some of the more negative aspects of this development of precarious non-standard forms of work in order to fight segmentation of the labor market, in order to ensure that we don't get low or working poor or people who get caught into this situation. And we have done a proposal just before Christmas. We presented a proposal which deals with two aspects. One is increasing the information that is given at the start of the employment relationship, so that the worker knows exactly the conditions. This is a revision of an old directive from 1991, which increases the information rights. So, and we have the changes we've done here, or proposed rather, is to take away a number of exceptions, but also to use the definition of worker that the European Court of Justice has developed, in order to make sure that there is at least a kind of a minimum framework for what is a worker. in the EU when it comes to these information requirements. And this is very important when you then look at issues of discrimination or fight undeclared work, etc., that you have this from the start of the working relationship. The second thing we're doing is that we are proposing to introduce a number of minimum rights which deal with these extreme precarious situations. So, for example, this to have not to have exclusivity clauses when they're not needed, not to have excessive probation periods that set labor law out of force, so to say, by having probation periods that are not justified for years. What we're also proposing is to have some kind of predictability, not for standard forms of work, but for these people on, for example, zero-hour contracts, so that if they refuse or if they don't take up this offer to come in and work, it's not that they then get fired by not getting called again. They can easily take up the job, but we try to prevent the situation where they get punished for not reacting within an hour's notice. We're doing this in what we believe is a very flexible framework with a lot of roles for the social partners, and in order to be able to adapt this to different sectors of society, or of the labor market, sorry. So if we look at the benefits that we hope to get, we see that in this, under this provision of that the statistics are not that refined when it comes to exactly how this works in practice on the labor market. We have a very low estimate of 2 to 3 million workers that would get information about their jobs at the start of the relationship that do not get it today. So that's one benefit. I know we don't have that much time, so I will jump. And here are the aspects of new rights. And I forgot, I see now, to mention training. That's another right that it's already there, but we re-emphasize this in light of these precarious jobs, that if there is obligatory training that needs to be had, that's point 5 here on the slide, then that training should not be charged to the employee. Let's say that you have a Deliveroo biker, and there is some kind of, you need to have some kind of safety, health and safety training, etc., then that would be on the cost of the employer. I'm afraid that there isn't such health and safety training for the Deliveroo bike cyclists, but if there would be, it should be. If there's an obligatory requirement to have it, then that would be on the cost. That would be cost-free for the worker. So if we look then, if I move to the last slide, just saying what we want to achieve, and this proposal is now being brought forward then by the Bulgarian Presidency, and the European Parliament is also taking it up. So we're hoping to advance rapidly in order to get these benefits. So you see them here. There is a transparency element, giving the workers in these precarious situations a possibility to understand their rights, enforce their rights, plan their work and life, not being excluded from having other sources of income if they are in a precarious situation, and also being able to request, at least to request, but there's no obligation for the employer to give a better opportunity, but at least to be able to inquire about a more stable working relationship. And this is all focused on this segmentation risk that we have, that people get stuck in these jobs without any possibility to develop. And you see the facts at the bottom in terms of the numbers we have calculated in terms of benefits. So we're in a very intense negotiation now, where we're trying to see how the member states are seeing how this would be applied in their national frameworks, also seeing how the Parliament will respond, because the Parliament actually had a lot higher ambitions than this proposal, and we'll see how they respond to this proposal that doesn't forbid, for example, zero-hour contracts or other forms of work. So we are very interested now going into this negotiation. We're hoping that the ministers here will be able to bring it forward already in June. Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much for providing us this high opportunity of so much and so much complicated and many legal dossiers that we have the opportunity to move on during our presidency. And now we'll go on with another angle of our discussion, and this is the non-standard employment opportunities and challenges for the future of work. That would be presented by Ms. Burke, Senior Economist in the International Labour Organization. She is a senior economist in the Inclusive Labour Market, Labour Relations and Working Conditions branch of the ILO in Geneva. Since joining the ILO in 2002, she has conducted research on the economic effects of labour laws, as well as provided technical assistance to our constituents on policies for generating jobs and improving working conditions. She is the author of several books and numerous articles on employment and labour market institution, and was the lead author of the recent ILO report, Non-Standard Employment Around the World, Understanding Challenges Shaping Prospects. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I'll be presenting some of the findings of the ILO report on non-standard forms of employment. This report is the outcome of a tripartite meeting of experts that we held at the ILO in 2015 on the topic of non-standard forms of employment. And it was a very important meeting. It was a tripartite meeting of experts, and it was important because there was a consensus among the social partners and the governments that non-standard forms of employment, we can't get rid of them, they're here to stay, but the challenge really is how to make them decent. So with that mandate, we've done this work and we continue to work on this topic. So what do we mean by non-standard employment? At the ILO, we're looking basically at 4 categories of non-standard employment. The first one is temporary employment. So this could be, your kind of formal fixed-term contracts, but it could be also your informal casual work. So, we are a global organization. We look a lot at developing countries. The issue of casual work is still very important in developing countries, and now it has kind of reemerged again in the developed world as well, with some of the platform economy and some of the new forms of employment. We also look at part-time and on-call work, so traditional part-time, but also other types of marginal short-term contracts, including zero-hours contracts. So there's a bit of an overlap then between the issue of zero-hours contracts and casual work. We looked at multi-party employment relationships, so this could be employment through a temporary employment agency, for example, but also other forms of labor subcontracting. It comes through a wide variety of names around the world, sometimes referred to as labor dispatch, labor brokering, but it seems to exist pretty much everywhere. And then finally, a 4th category, which includes the disguised bogus self-employment, but also includes this kind of gray area of dependent self-employment. So somebody who maybe started off as an independent worker, but then over time became very reliant on one client, and then maybe over time the clients start making more demands. And here the interesting case is how in a few of the European countries there's actually a legal category on dependent self-employment. So luckily, Stefan has showed you in his presentation some of the numbers on non-standard employment. Since I only have 10 minutes, I wasn't going to go into that. But we see that really around the world, there's been an increase. Some of the reaction that we got from the developing countries as well, there's nothing new about this, non-standard is standard in our countries. But what we see as well is that even in those pockets of the labor market in developing countries where there were some very good standard jobs, say the public sector or the manufacturing sector, you've seen an increase in non-standard employment. So there you have the double challenge of kind of informal casual work, which is a very big part of the labor market, and then on top of that, the growth of non-standard employment in in kind of some of the more reliable sectors, let's say. Okay, so what are the reasons for the dynamics? I'm not going to go into too much detail. We kind of delineate three main causes. The first is the transformations in the world of work, certainly important, and it's hit all countries. The rise of the service sector. The service sector requires more flexible employment contracts. It needs more workers on the weekends and the evenings, so part-time work has risen. There's pressures from globalization and competition, which, force firms to use other type of contracts perhaps to lower costs or just to use temporary employment because of fluctuations in demand. There's technological developments, which go hand in hand with all of these changes. But there's also been a real shift in organizational practices, and that's really the move from the vertical firm to a horizontal structure, the realization by companies that they needed to focus on their core competencies. So, first they started outsourcing, let's say, the catering services and security, and then next is the HR department and the IT department. And this is a trend that we see across the world. The other part of the story, though, however, that's very important is the role of regulation. And in many countries, there's been what we call a partial deregulation. So standard employment still stayed, but there was the introduction of new forms of employment contracts, which led to their use. On the other hand, we also see what we call distorted incentives, and this really comes especially from Social Security law, where there's instances where there's thresholds. So if you work fewer than so many hours per week or less than so much amount of time, the employer doesn't have to pay Social Security contributions or has to pay lower Social Security contributions, and as a result, there's an incentive to use these forms because they're cheaper. And this is something that we don't want. We want employers to use the forms because they actually need the flexibility, and in many instances that is the case, but not because it's cheaper, because when it's just because it's cheaper, it usually ends in degrading the working standards. And then, of course, another factor is also the decline in unionization and the regulatory role of collective bargaining. When collective bargaining decreased or wasn't present in some sectors, it meant that new forms of employment emerged. And then finally, there's, of course, the role of macroeconomic fluctuations and crises. When there's macroeconomic crises, it means that a lot of people on fixed-term contracts, they won't have their contract renewed, so they'll lose their job. At the same time, if there's a lot of insecurity in macroeconomic conditions, then firms are more apt then to use temporary employment contracts, for example, because of this uncertainty. Okay, so we did an analysis in our report as well on the firm use of non-standard employment, and there we really discovered some interesting things. For example, there's some sectors that are heavily reliant on non-standard forms of employment. There's no surprises there. Construction, transport, hotel and tourism. They have seasonal fluctuations. They need to have a more variable workforce. But when we looked really at the firms that are using it, we identified really a group of firms that we call the intensive users. And these were firms where more than 50% of their workforce were on temporary contracts. So this data here is on temporary contracts. And there we found that really there was no clear pattern. It wasn't because of the type of sector that they were in. It was really because it was the reflection of a particular organizational strategy on the part of the firms to use non-standard forms to use temporary employment in this case. And here, just to give you on the right, this is data from the Structure of Earnings Survey from the European Union, comparing Spain and Norway. You can see Spain, the orange is the moderate use so the blue is firms that don't use any temporary labor. So really the majority of firms actually overall were not using temporary labor. For our data set, it was close to 70%. Then you had a group of firms that use it what we called moderately. In Spain, you can see that's the orange bar there, and I can't read from that far away. It was around 30%. And then the gray is the intensive use. And so you can see really in Spain compared to Norway how there's this really intensive use of temporary employment within the firms. Okay, so what are some of the implications for workers? This was a real important focus of our work. We identified really 7 areas to look at. One is the effect on employment. So what does it mean as far as the career path of the worker? And here it's really the debate on the stepping stone or the trap. Are these jobs a stepping stone into the labor market, into better forms of employment, or are they a trap? And what we found, going back to the data here on Spain and Norway, for example, is that in those countries where the use of non-standard forms of employment was more moderate, these jobs were a stepping stone. But when it was really widespread, you ended up having labor market segmentation, and it was very difficult then for workers to jump to better jobs. And so they tended to circulate between, let's say, a temporary contract to unemployment to a temporary contract to unemployment. Okay, but then we looked at other areas. We looked at the effect on working hours, work scheduling, control over your scheduling, earnings. Let me show you that slide. Okay, so this is a literature review of wage penalties for temporary work. We did a very extensive literature review of econometric studies looking at male temporary workers and how they compared with male non-indefinite contract workers. So we're looking at men because of the gender wage gap. It was important just to focus on men. So controlling for occupation, controlling for level of education. We see that in all countries that we have surveyed, that we aggregated here, that there's wage penalties for being in temporary work. The one that has a wage premium is an exception, and that's Cambodia, because in their legislation, if you're on a fixed-term contract, at the end of that contract, you actually get a bonus. So there's an incentive for workers then to be on fixed-term contracts. So going back, we also looked at the topic of occupational safety and health, which is really important, especially in the area of multi-party employment relationships. Who is responsible for occupation and safety and health? This is also an issue that we're grappling with the platform economy. Is it the platform that's responsible, the client, who exactly, and how do we govern this? Of course, what are the impacts on Social Security? If somebody is rotating between temporary employment contracts and unemployment, this has a real impact on their Social Security coverage at the time of retirement or at unemployment. What is the impact on training? And then, of course, what is the impact on voice and representation, the right to collective bargaining, but also other fundamental principles and rights at work? Okay, so we came up with this kind of summarizes really our contribution as to how we think we should address these issues, and we really wanted to make it the importance of not just supporting workers through a expanded social safety net or portable benefits. All these things are fine, but it's really important to also make the jobs better. It's not enough to just have some sort of newly designed Social Security, social protection programs that support the workers. That's important. But making the jobs better is fundamental, because the jobs isn't just about the income, it's also about those other dimensions in that wheel that I showed you. It's about the access to training, it's about the occupational safety and health, it's about all these other multifaceted issues. Is the worker going to be protected against discrimination? So it's not just enough to have, for example, a basic income and then just get rid of all regulations, because we really need to make sure that the jobs themselves are decent jobs. So you can make jobs better either through legislative responses, or you can do it through other forms of regulations, such as through collective bargaining. And then from the issue of supporting workers, of course, the importance of social protection, but also other wider employment and social policies. So, for our recommendations, we drew on guidance from international labor standards. We actually have conventions on quite a few of these issues, on private employment agencies, on part-time work, on the employment relationship recommendation from 2006. We also looked at the EU directives, which provide a lot of guidance as well as to how we should address these issues. But then, we also looked at national best practices. So, summarizing what our 6 main recommendations are for plugging regulatory gaps, starting with the first one, it's equality of treatment. When I was speaking earlier about the issue of, distorted incentives, what we want really is that it doesn't matter what the employment contract is, everybody should have the same access to the same rights and the same benefits. So they might need to be on a pro rata basis, but it needed to be there. So even if you work 5 hours a week, you should be part of the Social Security system. You should have a pro rata also access to annual leave, for example, and to sick leave. Then there's the issue of minimum hours and safeguards. This actually really corresponds very well with what Stefan was just saying, the importance of, workers knowing in advance what their schedule is, having, some sort of way of managing their life, because there's one thing to talk about these contracts as being flexible, but if you don't know when you're going to work and you don't have the ability to say no, that you can't come in because you have childcare responsibilities or because you're taking a course, then that's not going to provide the worker with much flexibility. Then there's the issue of freedom of association and collective bargaining. For us, of course, it's a fundamental right. So we need to assure that all workers have access. And then there's there's some countries that have some legislation that impedes workers on non-standard forms of employment for having access, so that needs to be removed. But then there's also the issue that workers who are on temporary contracts, for example, sometimes fear joining a trade union because they fear that they might not have their contract be renewed. Then the issue of employment misclassification, here, for example, the bogus self-employment. This is something that needs to be addressed. It's been rising all over the world. It has important implications for Social Security systems. So there needs to be really more action on addressing this issue. There needs to be attention paid to the issues of assigning obligations and liabilities in multi-party employment relationships. And in some cases, non-standard employment does have to be restricted. And so the example, the sine qua non example is that you shouldn't be able to replace striking workers with temporary workers, for example. But there's also situations where workers are doing permanent tasks of the firms and are on temporary contracts renewed for many, many years. And we see this, for example, in the Andean countries, and some attention might need to be paid to that. Oops. Okay. Okay, so then collective responses, I don't think I have much time, so I'm just very quickly. We find really that actually collective responses are a great way to deal with these issues. We looked at a lot of collective bargaining contracts. It's a way to address, for example, within a company, if you want to have a threshold for the number of workers on non-standard contracts, or how these non-standard contracts could then be turned into standard contracts. Then, as I mentioned, social protection, there do need to be some adjustments to social protection systems to make them more encompassing, to allow workers in non-standard forms of employment to have be part of the system, and to also be able to have access to benefits. So we have a series of recommendations on how that can be done. And then finally, we also recognize that you can have the most beautiful laws and policies in the world, but if you don't have economic growth, that's a real problem. So there does need to be a lot more attention paid to supporting full employment, to having some sort of industrial policies, to really, creating jobs in the countries so that there is a place for, decent job creation. We are also inspired by the work of Gunther Schmidt. So we took some of his work on employment insurance and how employment insurance systems need to be adapted to follow workers through their labor market transitions in their working life. And finally, the issue of supporting care, how we can have good public policies to support care, have very decent jobs in the care economy as well, and that can be a source of good jobs, and how that really allows then workers to participate actively in the labor market. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. And now let's see the different dimensions of the job quality. I'll give the floor to Ms. Barbara Getzenberger, Head of Unit for Working Life in Eurofound. She has, before her experience in Eurofound, some experience in DG Ample in the European Commission and the European Metal Workers Federation as a researcher. So here's your floor.